In this video lesson, we'll discuss the President of the United States and the President of the Confederate States of America and compare them, and we'll also talk about the conscription that began during the Civil War. President Davis versus President Lincoln. The Confederate government, like King Cotton, had some fatal weaknesses. Its Constitution, which borrowed liberally from that of the Union, contained one deadly defect. Created by secession, it could not logically deny future secession to its constituent states. And Jefferson Davis, who was the President of the Confederate States of America, had in view a well-knit central government. Determined states' rights supporters fought him bitterly to the end, and the Richmond regime encountered difficulty persuading certain state troops to serve outside their own borders. States' rights were no less damaging to the Confederacy than they had been to the United States. President Davis was repeatedly in hot water. He, at times, enjoyed real personal popularity, and at times there was serious talk of impeachment, unlike Abraham Lincoln. Davis was somewhat imperious and inclined to defy rather than to lead public opinion, and suffering acutely from nervous disorders, he overworked himself with the details of both civil government and military operations. Lincoln also had his troubles, but the North enjoyed the prestige of a long-established government, financially stable and fully recognized both at home and with countries abroad. Lincoln proved superior to the more inexperienced and less flexible Davis. He developed a genius for interpreting and leading a public opinion war, but still demonstrated charitableness towards the South and tolerance toward infighting colleagues. Abraham Lincoln will also impose some limitations on wartime liberties to help him fight the war. Congress, which was in crisis, generally accepted or confirmed the president's questionable acts. Lincoln did not believe that his iron-handed authority would continue after the war. Congress was not in session when war erupted, so Lincoln gathered up the reins. Brushing aside legal obligations, he proclaimed the blockade of the southern states. These actions will also be later upheld by the Supreme Court when they are challenged. He arbitrarily, which means without the approval of Congress, increased the size of the federal army, which is something that only Congress can do under the Constitution. But Congress will later approve the fact that Lincoln had done this. He directed the Secretary of the Treasury to advance $2 million without appropriation or security to 3 private citizens for military purposes. This was a grave irregularity contrary to the Constitution. He also suspended the previous privilege of the writ of habeas corpus so that anti-unionists might be arrested and held until Lincoln could determine whether they were a danger to the United States. He defied a dubious ruling by the Chief Justice that the safeguards of habeas corpus could be set aside only by an authorization of Congress. Lincoln's regime was guilty of many other high-handed acts. There was supervised voting in the border states. Federal officials also ordered the suspension of certain newspapers and the arrest of their editors on grounds of obstructing the war. Jefferson Davis was less able than Lincoln to exercise arbitrary power, mainly because of the confirmed states' writers who fanned an intense spirit of localism. To the very end, owners of horse-drawn vans in Petersburg, Virginia, prevented the sensible joining of the incoming and outgoing tracks of a militarily vital railroad. Northern armies were at first manned solely by volunteers, with each state assigned a quota based on population. But in 1863, after volunteering had slackened off, Congress passed a federal conscription law for the first time on a nationwide scale in the United States. The conscription law is more commonly known as the draft. The provisions were grossly unfair to the poor. Rich boys could hire substitutes to go in their places or purchase exemptions outright by paying $300. $300 men was the scornful epithet applied to these slackers and draftees who complained. The draft was especially damned in the Democratic strongholds of the North, notably in New York City. A frightful riot broke out in 1863, touched off largely by underprivileged and anti-black Irish Americans who shouted, "Down with Lincoln." For several days, the city was at the mercy of the pillaging mob. Scores of lives were lost, and the victims included many lynched African Americans. Elsewhere in the North, conscription met with resentment and an occasional minor riot. The Irish Americans in New York City, it's not that they approved of slavery, but they really did not want to have the slaves freed because they did not want to have to compete with them for jobs. More than 90% of the Union troops were volunteers. Since social and patriotic pressures to enlist were strong, as able-bodied men become scarcer, generous bounties for enlistment were offered by federal, state, and local authorities, and they could be as much as $1,000. With money flowing freely, a crew of bounty brokers and substitute brokers sprang up at home and abroad, and they combed the poorhouses of the British Isles and Western Europe for substitutes. Sometimes the bounty boys deserted, volunteered elsewhere, netted another haul, and then these bounty jumpers sometimes repeated this profitable operation, which means that once you enlisted, you were paid a sum of money to enlist. And so they would enlist somewhere and collect the money and stay for a little while and then desert, and then move to another state and enlist and collect the money and stay for a little while and then desert again. So as a result, the rolls of the Union Army recorded about 200,000 deserters of all classes, and the Confederate authorities were plagued with a runaway problem of similar proportions. Like the North, the South at first relied mainly on volunteers, but since the Confederacy was much less populous, it scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel much more quickly. The Richmond regime was forced to resort to conscription as early as April 1862, nearly a year earlier than the Union. Confederate draft regulations also worked serious injustices. As in the North, a rich man could hire a substitute or purchase exemption, and slave owners could do this as well. These special privileges made for bad feelings among the less prosperous, many of whom complained that this was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. No large-scale draft riots broke out in the South, but Confederate conscription agents avoided those areas inhabited by sharpshooting mountain whites. We'll discuss more about the impact of conscription on the Civil War in our classroom discussions.